Matthew, what are 2 or 3 things that people must get right to create Indigenous digital communities?
The three most important things are, transparency and authenticity, accountability and consequences, and a deep connection to community. Without that connection to community and without the accountability that comes with that, I think there are significant risks about moving forward in this new environment.
You're listening to OneFeather, Two Pens. Lessons and stories from Indigenous peoples, building and navigating digital sovereignty. A special series on What's That Noise?
Well, Gila Kasla, Gikumeng. Hello to our listeners across Turtle Island, our family, our friends, our allies, our brothers and sisters. I'm going to take a moment to do a quick land acknowledgement. And we're going to do this not as a new practice developed by colonial institutions or kind of modern new kind of way of thinking. We've always done this. We've always done a land acknowledgement. And it's a tradition dating back for centuries with many Native communities and nations. And for non-Indigenous communities, a land acknowledgement is really a powerful way of showing respect and an honor for Indigenous people, and particularly in Canada, with regard to our unique relationship with you and with Canada, and as your neighbors and as your friends and as your family. And the acknowledgement is really just a simple way of resisting, if you like, the erasure of Indigenous history and working towards honoring and living and inviting truth. And so we make space today for that here in this podcast to do an acknowledgement. And so I'm going to acknowledge where I'm at and invite you to do the same while you're listening. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm here on the traditional territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt people, the Lekwungen speaking people, that I have the benefit and the privilege and the honor and the love of working, playing, and raising my family here in your traditional and unceded territories. And it's with great honor and gratitude that I'm thankful for the opportunity to do that. It's in my language, we would say Hala Kasla, and I raise my hands. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Lawrence. Our guest today is an Indigenous rights advocate and member of the Lac La Ronge Indian Band in northern Saskatchewan. He is the president of the Urban Native Youth Association, a board member of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, the co-chair for the Vancouver Just Recovery Association, and he sits on the BC Climate Secretariat's Indigenous Climate Adaptation Working Group. He is also pursuing a PhD at UBC with a focus on the implementation of international Indigenous rights frameworks, which I'm selfishly really excited about as a fellow PhDer. It's my pleasure to have on the show Matthew Norris. And Matthew, where to begin? At such a young age, you've already accomplished so much. I am struggling to figure out how you prioritize it all. As an educator, as a researcher, as a community member, as an advocate, as somebody who's involved in politics and policy, what's keeping you busy these days? What is at the top of your mind?
I mean, you did a fairly comprehensive introduction.
All right, we're done. Thank you.
See you later, guys. Cue the music.
Impressive guy.
But I've been working on UNDRIP implementation. Has been a primary passion of mine for a long time. Just kind of to realize its potential as an international mechanism that finally applies universal basic human rights to Indigenous people. And we're finally seeing some momentum building at the federal government and the provincial government and within cities across Canada. So that's been taking up a lot of my time. I've started a new position as a senior policy analyst with the BC Assembly of First Nations, focusing on UNDRIP implementation. I've got a book chapter that's going to be published fairly soon. I don't know if I can share too much about it, but it's a thing and it's coming. I've also been doing a lot of work and kind of advocacy around urban Indigenous communities. And so I'm the president of the Urban Native Youth Association in Vancouver, where we're looking at kind of creating an Indigenous keystone community within Vancouver and getting it recognized in terms of a building and a youth center and post-secondary education and Indigenous housing and what UNDRIP means for urban Indigenous communities. I think that's an important conversation that we're starting to have now. And it's what my research has been focused on, a lot of writing that I do on how to kind of repair the kind of rifts in our communities that have been resulting from colonialism. So I've been doing that. In the fall, I ran for city council in Vancouver. That was a time in my life that happened. But I mean, and it's all related. Like that, the decision to do that was also directly related to my belief that we needed more Indigenous representation and decision making tables, and the role that cities can play in addressing some of the discrimination and marginalization of it, not only the urban Indigenous communities, but host nations whose territory cities live on. Cities have a big role to play in that. And, we haven't seen representation in that area for a while. And, but so I've been keeping busy, I think, to say the least.
Generally, when I encounter people who are doing a doctorate, they don't usually have all of this other stuff and experience going on too. So yeah, I think it might be fair to say that you've been keeping quite busy. And I'm getting the sense already in this episode that we could easily do like a mini series just on your experience and your focuses. On the one hand, I'm really compelled and curious to ask about UN DRIP and international Indigenous rights framework, because this is a really interesting moment in the genesis of One Feather, Two Pens. We generally talk about Canada. We generally talk about digital space that we hope to think doesn't always have discernible, obvious cartographies and boundaries that sovereigns chop out for one another or the corporations chop out to include or exclude certain populations. But on the other, we have this really interesting opportunity to talk about urban architecture and intersections with the digital. And so I want to put it out to you, if I may, to kick off our first question here. When you do your work and research around indigeneity and urban spaces, whether it's local or it's global, where does the digital come up for you? Is it spaces and moments or opportunities that are progressive? Do you encounter them as hindrances, or is there something that I could be missing here down the middle?
I think it's changed so much even in recent years. Like the research I did and the way that you connected with community even 10 years ago has shifted so much in the face of digital evolution and change and tools and communities that have been created. And so it's kind of a new frontier, which has, a ton of opportunities that are exciting and make certain projects easier and certain ways of doing things in advocacy and support our rights-based movements. And that's exciting. And then at the same time, there's pitfalls with this new digital environment too, that because it's so new, I don't know if we've had that conversation yet about how do we engage in this? How do we avoid the pitfalls? How do we create a digital community? And I think that's the critical word is digital community. How do we create a community that avoids the pitfalls that we're starting to see? And it comes up, if we're talking about how I, as an Indigenous person, has used digital community, or how I've seen division within digital areas kind of get reinforced, and the impacts of that on our political momentum, and what we saw during the municipal election in Vancouver, and what we see in elections across the country, and how that impacts the Indigenous rights goals and objectives, and so it's a fascinating conversation to have.
You're absolutely right. I mean, there's this real risk that if as we create this digital community, that we will lose control of it. And I don't know that we have control of it now, so to speak. But if we kind of let that kind of play out a little bit, that it's important that we create some sacredness around this space, so that it's created in a way that embraces our values and principles, so that it's not a toxic thing. It's really a community building thing. And it's a space for conversation and discussion, and how we build that, and what are the rules of engagement around that? Just like in our cultural and social practices, or in our past political practices, like what are the rules of engagement here? And I think a lot of us don't know. We're just out there kind of doing our thing. And I think when I think about how the amazing and scarily fast evolution of AI is happening in the background right now. Like we're starting to use it from some of our programming and some content generation even. And it is just insane how scary that is. I feel like we're always just drowning under this stuff and just trying to get to the surface to make space for our own communities and perspective. And what's your advice or guidance on kind of framing that, or how do we navigate that?
I think we have to do it consciously. I think like I mean, I'm no expert in this, in like digital environments and ethics and all that sort of stuff. Like that's not my field of expertise, but the way I see it is this a tool, or is this going to be a hindrance in addressing, impacts of colonization on our people, in addressing socioeconomic, quality of life standards? Is it going to be a tool in that regards? And I see, yes, but I think with anything, the risk is seeing it as this kind of neutral space, as not being influenced by systems of power or marginalization that exist in every other form of life. If we assume that this digital environment, digital community is immune from that carries risks, I think.
Oh yeah.
And so when we talk about, like what are the uses of it right now, there's a ton. When we look at our communities that have been, divided both physically, but culturally, and you're removed from your community, your language, your culture. It's now a great time to reconnect through digital communities. Like you have access to so many more resources now than you had 10 years ago to learn about your language, to learn about your culture, to learn about, your community and your family. It's more readily available now. But with that, comes risk too.
Yeah. And great responsibility, right? Like what's that? I don't know what that saying is, but with great power comes great responsibility. I'm not sure if that's accurate or not, but it is one of those things, right? And I think about how, from a traditional perspective, right, and in terms of how we used to conduct ourselves, is that folks would spend a good portion of their lives being trained to fulfill a role, right? And they would be elevated to that role when community thought they were ready, right? So it's a bit different now. I mean, you've got this incredible educational background and experience, and you're completing your PhD, and you've got this tremendous skill set and potential in making all these contributions in all this kind of amazing ways. How do you reconcile that with that kind of traditional kind of perspective? And I don't mean that in a negative way. I'm just like, how do we bridge the gap, or how do we create space for folks who are listening to this, maybe young folks who are listening to this, and say, yeah, I want to go down this path and I'm a little bit afraid. How do we help them navigate whatever that looks like?
And I think it's, it comes back to community again. It comes back to being in community and holding yourself accountable to that community, like wherever you go. And so if you look at that within academia, if you choose to go that route, if you choose to go into politics or rights advocacy work or what have you, you need to build the processes and the mechanisms that hold you accountable to the community that you are working on behalf of. It's absolutely critical. And when you look at, what systems of power and influence exist within these spaces, like academic institutions or our political institutions within the city, they weren't built by our people for our people, representing how our people do things and make decisions and relate to each other. And so being mindful of that and mindful how, I think it was Dr. Dale Turner who talks about how we need word warriors, I think is how he calls it, in these institutions, advocating on behalf of our people and using the power that's inherent with these institutions to advocate and push for change, but at the same time recognizing that these institutions also change the people working within them, because you have to work within them. There's different pulls and pushes. And so to protect yourself from that, it's about building community and building accountability to the community that you want to represent. So they're the ones holding you accountable in relationship with them for your actions and your decisions. And I think that applies to the digital space too. And like, that's one of my big concerns with the digital environment is it seems like it's easier to skirt that accountability.
Oh yeah.
And so how do we build community accountability in a digital environment? I think that's a big question.
Yeah, it is a big question. And if I can circle back to my introduction, that was apparently comprehensive. I find myself still really fascinated with the international focus of your work. As I said before, we have a kind of a more domestic focus as a starting point in the show, and here we are talking to somebody who is Indigenous and is studying UN. And when I think about international frameworks and international bodies that try to regulate and try to standardize, I start scratching my head and I say, what's at stake in trying to standardize or universalize? When you look at international law, for example, as soon as you start establishing the principles, the precedents, the guiding points, the frameworks, I think sometimes what's at stake of what's being lost is nuance. Especially when it comes to identity. So I'm wondering if we could maybe just riff and rhyme a little bit when it comes to accountability of the international institution. You know, what can you tell us what you've seen that they're getting right and perhaps what they're not getting right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, kind of getting back to my original point about addressing power imbalances and the kind of how these institutions get created and who creates them. You look at the international system; it was fairly predominantly created without Indigenous people, and so it's only in the last 20 years, I think is maybe a generous account even, where you've had Indigenous voices, Indigenous participation at international forum, with the ability to actually drive norms and change actions and have an impact on states' intentions, and that's significant. And so, and once again, it's kind of just scaling up the same question about the kind of impacts and responsibilities of Indigenous people in academia or domestic political institutions, and now at the international level, where it's about accountability and it's about community building. And so when you look at like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it was primarily the result of a network of Indigenous leaders from across the world who are able to connect to each other, to learn from each other, and to recognize similarities within their experiences in a variety of different countries, and to take that lesson to the international forums and then advocate for real change. And so, and then reconnecting that back to this digital conversation, that's the potential, is being able to learn and not have to operate in silos. That, was, the divide and conquer ideology of colonialism. It was, now we can fight back against that by building networks and building communities with not only different Indigenous nations and communities within Canada, but also internationally, who share an experience, who share lessons learned, who have gone down different roads to try and achieve justice and decolonization and self-determination and all that, and have had different successes with different approaches, and can share those lessons now across that international divide. Now we can do that digitally, which makes it so much easier, is to be able to build those networks of community. But
me from a OneFeather perspective and the work we do in this digital space, I'm trying to make space to navigate this in a good way. And I have to be honest, I mean, a lot of what we do is new and it hasn't been done before. What does it even look like when we think about making space for that and going and doing it in a good way? How do we marry that right to self-determination and self-government, as well as free, prior and informed consent around this digital space? How do we, those conversations are, I don't know that they're direct. I think they're more kind of elusive, because when you're out there kind of creating this kind of new architecture and this new environment or this new ecosystem in this digital space, it's pretty murky and it's pretty blurry. There's just so much burden here that we're probably going to get this thing wrong. And man, oh man, I don't want to be the owner of that. So,
but don't you need to be like? Don't I mean that's the like when I teach students, and students always have this question about, like, how do you work with Indigenous communities? We're coming from such a dearth and such a lack of kind of education on the impacts of colonization and avenues for justice and Indigenous people's histories and kind of contemporary identities and issues. There's such a lack of education from, like, when I went to high school, we weren't taught. That wasn't in the curriculum. And you go to university and you start engaging. And I think things are starting to shift and change. And so students ask, like, I don't want to mess up. I don't want to make a mistake. My intentions are good. I'm trying to do the right thing, but I feel like I'm inherently going to make a mistake or misstep, and I don't. And so how do I avoid that? And my advice to them has always been, you're going to make a mistake. And it's the way that you handle the mistake is the important lesson to learn. If you handle it with humility and you take the leadership from the community that you're trying to work with, and you're willing to open yourself up to being wrong and to kind of learning and adjusting, that's where we need to go. Yeah. And so, and taking back that again to this kind of conversation about digital space, I think the opportunity is that we're introducing more people. We have the potential to introduce more people to the conversation who haven't had that conversation or been witness to that conversation. But at the same time, we're seeing like the creation of silos, whether that's through the algorithms or what media sources you get sent and what articles are pinged to your accounts or whatnot. You also see the creation of silos where people are artificially removed from those conversations and don't witness them. And that is the danger of this digital space, is when you kind of reify divisions rather than bridging different communities to have a discussion.
Yeah, it also breeds a lot of conspiracy theory, right, around what is happening, which may not be in fact happening at all. I mean, this is the untethered reality of this digital space, right? Like, it's like, what is really happening? Just like, I don't know, man.
But it's I mean, like, that's also the interesting thing too, is like, and I'm not an expert in this, and so I might get this wrong, and I'm open to getting it wrong, and tell me if I got it wrong. But it's like, it's not this like neutral space. Like, it's designed by people to have certain outcomes and interactions. And then when you talk about who's designing it, is it Indigenous people? Are we in those rooms talking about how these digital environments exist and relate to others, and what conversations get promoted or happen or allowed to happen? Not really. Yeah. And so I think it's important, like, this conversation is important to have more of, just to start kind of wedging our own kind of space into into this new world.
Yeah, that's bang on. I think that's bang on, totally.
When I was starting some of my studies, I remember coming across an idea from an author called Lawrence Lessig. He wrote a piece called Code 2.0, and I remember him commenting that the world can either program or code the internet to be open, or you can code it to be closed. The coding has already been set out. It's a colonial system. It's designed by people who are in positions of power and have those kinds of privileges that are not often checked. They're not often corrected. And so in a lot of ways, you see different communities and different groups around the planet try to build their way through this kind of architecture and run into dead ends and run into blockages that might not be intentional but are impossible to negotiate. So now I'm thinking a little bit about UN DRIP and some of the principles, some of the articles within the document itself, which talks about different ways in which tech can enable protection. Tech can support and elevate or bring Indigenous communities around the planet up to maybe level the table a little bit and get around some of these tensions that I've been talking about. When you've been doing your studies, Matthew, or in your experience out in the field or through anything that you've read, could you maybe give our listeners some examples of where you can see tech playing a role that is protective or perhaps progressive? Would that be around specific language roles? Would that be around cultural components? Maybe it's a more spiritual component?
So the UN Declaration is like a comprehensive articulation of, I mean, I think it's pretty clear. I think it's pretty important to note that it doesn't create new rights. It's not this document that has finally created Indigenous rights. So that's not what it is. It's an application of existing universal human rights to the particular historical and contemporary context of Indigenous peoples from around the world. So that's critical. Two, I would suggest you can't read any of the articles in isolation from each other. It's a comprehensive document. And I say that, and now I'm going to go through the different articles, but I mean, it's critical because they all speak to each other and they all kind of reinforce each other. And then the third thing to emphasize is that it's the minimum standard. It's not the gold standard. It's not this idea that we should, look up to the UN Declaration as this aspirational document. It's not. It's the very minimum that we need to do to address the ongoing marginalization, dispossession of Indigenous people. There are declarations and international human rights mechanisms out there that go much further than the UN Declaration. To be clear. So set that groundwork aside. The UN Declaration does a lot. It recognizes the rights of Indigenous people to self-determination, to self-government, to sit at decision-making tables which impact their rights. It recognizes land rights, rights to culture, to languages, to education, childcare. It contains articles that address racism and discrimination against Indigenous peoples. And so it sets out all of these different avenues to kind of address long-going marginalization. And so when you look at marginalization, and when you look at like the implementation of the UN Declaration, which we're starting to see in Canada, the Canadian government passed a bill a few years ago to begin implementation, and they're currently working on a draft national action plan in that regards. The province of BC came out with provincial legislation a few years before that and are a little bit further ahead. And both those legislations are fairly similar. One, it includes a commitment to aligning every law with the UN Declaration, to a national action plan, and then three, looking at kind of accountability and reporting mechanisms, which are absolutely critical. And now we're seeing municipalities starting to follow suit. So the City of Vancouver did so through a city motion about a year and a half ago, I think, if I'm getting the dates right. And so where I see digital technology coming in is addressing the kind of capacity concerns. So as we're seeing various governments kind of going through the work of engaging nations to review legislation, our communities aren't at that point where we have the internal capacity to review 20 legislations when the province has 300 staff doing this work. And you look at some communities that have like one staff person, 3 staff persons, like 20 staff people. They can't, it's a capacity concern. And so when you look at how do we address kind of the capacity differentials between provincial or federal governments and our First Nations governments, there's huge differentials there. And so digital technology potentially has the capacity to kind of help fill that gap and to help kind of reset those power differentials. But it also has, and I mean, when maybe we'll get to talking about like digital data ownership and jurisdiction, and how part of addressing power inequities is who controls data, who has access to data to do monitoring, to not only monitor, what has happened to implement the UN Declaration. Are ministries and departments following their own plans, and how effective are those plans to implement the UN Declaration and so forth. But it even comes down to basic things like monitoring the impacts on fish from a salmon farm. And so if you don't have the jurisdiction over the data and the control over the data to do your own research and monitoring over those impacts, and you're relying on a third party, or if you're relying on the industry, if you're relying on the government to provide you that analysis, that just furthers the power inequities within those decisions. So, I mean, there's a lot to discuss there in terms of what role does digital technologies play in kind of rebalancing that power differential on policy legislation.
Well, I mean, you totally just blew my mind, because I was just thinking about, I think about OneFeather and our kind of reach in the country. We have over 100,000 Indigenous folks verified inside of our ecosystem. And how could those folks be leveraged to, by their own consent and their own willingness to do so, but participate in exactly that thought experiment you just kind of advanced, was how could these folks be the eyes and ears of our people and our communities to take a look at these legislations, or these pathways, or these kind of efforts to give some Indigenous intelligence to what's happening, if you take my meaning, right? And so I was thinking, man, that would be super powerful, and I would be excited to be a part of that kind of development journey. So you got my head spinning in those wheels. They're a little clunky at the end of the week on a Friday, but you really got me thinking about how powerful that tool can be when used in a good way for our people. So I think that's an amazing thing to consider, right?
And I think, I mean, and that's just one aspect I see, linking, making maybe the jump here, like linking our conversations around digital technology, and then linking the UN Declaration and the different aspects we need to achieve those goals. And it's not just kind of political commitment, and it's not just accountability and monitoring. Those are critical aspects of it, but it's also education. And so having a voice in the digital space has a real potential to reach folks who haven't heard these conversations, or haven't heard the deliberations that we're having, or that communities are having, or and there's a real educational potential there too, to kind of bridge intergenerational kind of hurt and trauma that has resulted in a divided society that we seem to have. I mean, to some extent.
You're a member of Ronge, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they have elections coming up this pretty quickly here at the end of March. We've seen our communities and our people evolve through a fairly robust and entrenched hereditary or culturally appropriate kind of governance system, and then with colonialization, a shift to some extent, well, to a large extent for some, through this kind of Indian Act election, kind of elected chief and councils. And one of the things that's kind of starting to percolate in the back of my head is that as we introduce these digital technologies for these types of purposes, do we run the risk that we evolve into a new form of leadership selection through a digital ecosystem that is just a further transition from where we are? So what do you think about that? What do you think? Do you think the risk there is, or what's the good side or bad side, or what's the guidance there, I guess?
Well, I don't know if I would pick sides. That's an easy way out. But I mean, I also bring that back to the articles of the UN Declaration too, is that it's up for our nations to decide how we organize politically, how we govern ourselves, and enshrine our right to self-determination and self-government. And so this just gives us another tool in the bank and another option to choose from, which is great, because we haven't had options previously. We were told to organize one way, and we've been stuck with that. And there's been impacts of that, that have continued for generations. And so now we're getting to a space where nations and Indian band governments and communities can decide, is this working for us? Why is it not working for us? What other options exist? Are we going to develop our own constitution? Are we going to develop our own band codes? Are we going to move to a digital environment? How do we interact with our community that lives off reserve? And so if you look at our membership list, a significant portion of our band lives off reserve.
Yeah.
And in a kind of pre-digital environment, engaging those members was quite a significant task on kind of the direction where the nation wants to go. How do we interact with our lands and with our programming and with our rights? And so for me, that's kind of an interesting conversation is the opportunity now to kind of, and I talk about it in terms of like healing our communities, to the point where we're no longer disenfranchising or marginalizing our family members and relatives that don't live on the reserve and don't live in the community. Often for no fault of their own. It's through, addressing systems of poverty or going to find a job that you can't find in your community or education or family or whatnot. And so now we're living in a space where we can actually have conversations and options that aren't, cost prohibitive or whatnot, to kind of addressing these long-standing issues.
I think just full disclosure, Tommy, for our listeners, my company OneFeather will be supporting Lac La Ronge and their electoral officers in the election. So I just want to just as a function of disclosure, for sure.
It's a good disclosure to have in the show.
We talked about the importance of data ownership and custody of that, and doing that in a good and authentic way. And I know it's something that we want to go down a pathway where that we talk about sovereign, Indigenous digital identity and the credential that goes along with that, and that custody of that and the ownership of that needs to be held by the individual and verified by either through and it's back to this kind of closed system or a open public system, where in the spirit of our traditional kind of ways, or at least where I come from anyways, that identity is acknowledged by your aunties and your uncles and the chiefs and the family, right? And so how do we do that? And then how do you maintain ownership and custody of that? And how does that get used in that digital space? And it's a lot to wrap your head around because there's a lot of responsibility there to make that happen. But I do think we're at this interesting intersection now between how we used to do things as Indigenous folks in this regard with digital technologies today. And as as people are out there engaging you in that digital space, where do you retain the right to pull back, if you like, withdraw, own, and maybe even monetize within that right? But certainly ownership is key, because I think if we're not careful, we are just feeding a machine that will just has no other interest other than to consume us for its own potential, right?
I mean, ownership's interesting, because my immediate reaction to when you say ownership, I'm like who owns this? How, what does that mean? Like, when we talk about so much that's inherent to our communities and significant, whether it's like our stories or our practices or our medicines or our names, our languages, or even other things like decisions around land use, but in the digital space, like our identities. So much of that isn't owned, It's not owned by a person. It's owned by a community. It's owned by owned by relations. And so when you get into this kind of individualized digital space, that raises very significant questions around how are you accountable? For me, I guess it always comes back to accountability. I mean, we're also, you can't have this conversation without bringing into context what's happening in like broader society. And so what we're seeing is we're seeing a lot of, corporations, institutions, a lot of non-Indigenous society starting to grapple with what can we do to better support our Indigenous communities, to reconcile, to address our kind of positions of power and privilege. And so you're seeing like genuinely good-hearted, well-meaning attempts to kind of address this, but that also opens up space for grifters and for people willing to take advantage of that. And so, I mean, being mindful of that, it's about accountability. It's about building accountability mechanisms, allowing your auntie to call you out on something. So if you're operating in a digital environment where you can act anonymously, without verification, and without anyone calling to account your claims, and then monetizing it, that's a huge risk. And so how do we create a more kind of community-based digital environment that builds on that accountability, that has that checks and balances, but is also allowed to grow and to change and to adapt to this new environment? That's the question. And I don't know if we have an answer for that.
I don't either.
Yeah. But we don't need an answer too.
No,
it's a conversation, right?
That's right. Can you give us your top three?
Yeah, we definitely don't need to do that.
But, that accountability is so key. Like, as if I'm sitting in a big house and I was misbehaving, I'd get a whack by a stick, right? Like, I knew that was coming. The minute you'd always see it coming. But also there was public accountability out there, because people would speak and 500 people would be a witness. And if somebody got up, a month later and said something, backwards, or kind of not accurately, there would be there'd be an immediate call out of that, right? And so people, I think, you learn that truth and integrity, and that community, right, that social fabric that knits us all together, was what defined us, right? There was some risk if you took action to unravel that or unweave that. Like, people would hold you accountable for that, right?
And there's consequences if you ignored that criticism and just continued acting in a certain way. There were consequences on your relationships, consequences in your relationships with your family and with your community.
That's right.
And so how do we build, I don't know if consequences is the right word, but accountability into digital spaces in the same degree?
Yeah. No, I mean, the risk of being expelled from your community was worse than death. Like, you'd rather be, be ended as opposed to be expelled. I mean, so I hear you loud and clear. And I think that's, how do we do that? I don't know. How do we do that in a good way? I don't know, man. This is the thing, to your point. I don't know that we have the answers yet. We'll have to figure them out as we go, I guess. Yeah.
And I mean, that's the question too. Like, I like the different ways that we engage in digital spaces. Have they been designed to promote community accountability, or have they been designed around this individuality? I don't know. That's a question for someone more experienced than me. But
well, when we have 6 months more time behind us, we'll bring you back on to rediscuss and re-engage. But in the meantime, I wanted to thank you so very much, Matthew, for coming on the show. This has been incredibly insightful.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, brother. Really, really appreciate it, for sure.